February 23, 1945. Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima. Private First Class Tadashi Yamamoto, crouched in the damp darkness of a reinforced bunker, the air thick with volcanic dust and the metallic scent of fear. He scribbled into his diary, quick strokes, frantic strokes, words that would have condemned him to execution if his officers ever discovered them. The Marines are not human, they do not break, they do not collapse. Everything we were taught about American weakness was a lie. Minutes earlier, he had watched something that made every line of Japanese propaganda evaporate. 6 United States Marines had charged his position through a storm of machine gun fire. He saw 3 fall instantly, but the others kept coming. When his own unit hurled grenades to finish them, one Marine flung his body toward the blast to shield the others. He absorbed the explosion, staggered back to his feet, and fought until his blood loss overwhelmed him. The survivors captured the bunker within minutes. This was not supposed to happen. Japan had chosen Iwo Jima as a fortress meant to halt the American advance. 21,000 defenders, 18 kilometers of tunnels, interlocking fields of fire. They had been promised that American troops were soft, undisciplined, frightened of pain, and terrified of death. Instead, they met an enemy who defied every assumption. But this crisis of belief had begun long before Iwo Jima. August 7, 1942. Guadalcanal. Japanese soldiers were fighting their first major defensive battle of the Pacific War, convinced the Americans would be easily swept aside. They were wrong. Corporal Hideo Takahashi, a veteran who had fought in China and believed in Japan's sense of invincibility, wrote in his diary after a week of fighting, "The Americans here are not like any enemy we have faced. They do not retreat when surrounded. They do not surrender when trapped. And most astonishing, they fight at night as if darkness strengthens them." Japanese military doctrine taught that only their own soldiers could dominate night combat. Yet the Marines counterattacked in pitch-black jungle, firing with deadly precision, moving swiftly through terrain Japanese officers had labeled impossible to traverse. Everything Japanese intelligence believed about American troops was coming undone. Lieutenant Shigeru Fukudome led a reinforced company in a nighttime assault on August 20th, designed to reclaim Henderson Field. He was confident. His men had broken entire Chinese divisions. But when they struck the Marines, they walked directly into a killing field. The Marines had dug in, calibrated their machine guns, and waited. But what shocked Fukudome was not that the Americans defended themselves. It was that they immediately counterattacked, storming into the jungle darkness with ferocity and accuracy that no Japanese intelligence report had predicted. When his diary was found after he was killed days later, one line stood out. "We are the soldiers of night. Yet they attacked us in darkness, and we could not stop them." His company of 200 was reduced to 90 survivors. The Marines lost 12 men. Throughout Guadalcanal, Japanese troops encountered an American force that refused to break. Marines fought hand-to-hand when overrun, killed silently with knives, reoccupied positions thought lost, and met suicidal banzai charges with unwavering resolve. Japanese soldiers had been promised they were superior in courage, spirit, and discipline, yet they watched Marines endure what should have shattered them. Sergeant Kenji Matsumoto recorded his disbelief after witnessing an American machine gunner fight with both legs shattered, firing until Japanese troops physically overwhelmed him. His assistant instantly took over the gun. Matsumoto's words were simple: "We were told Americans would not die for one another, but we watched them do it over and over." By 1943, Japanese intelligence officers were openly unsettled by Marine behavior. Yamamoto himself had sat through briefings where an instructor, who had interrogated captured Marines, confessed that American training resembled something close to legalized brutality. Recruits were broken down completely, then rebuilt into something their own families would not recognize. They were conditioned to see surrender as worse than death, and to see retreat as betrayal. The officer described it with dread. "It is as if the Americans stole Bushido from us and merged it with their industrial strength. This combination is dangerous, deadly. Guadalcanal was the first shock. Tarawa was the second. At Tarawa, 4,500 Japanese defenders lay behind the strongest fortifications yet built in the Pacific. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki believed the Marines could not take the island in 100 years. They took it in 76 hours. Private First Class Tadashi Ogawa, one of just 17 survivors of the garrison, described watching a nightmare unfold. The first wave of Marines was slaughtered in the water. The second wave died on the beach. But the third wave reached the seawall, and they did not stop. Ogawa wrote, "We killed them by the hundreds, and still they came. When the flamethrowers arrived, we knew the island was lost. The island was drenched in blood. 6,400 men died in just 3 days, but the Marines reached every objective exactly on schedule. Japanese intelligence had to confront a new truth. They were not facing ordinary troops. They were facing shock troops, fighters who moved with the precision of a machine and the ferocity of men who did not consider death a deterrent." Captured Japanese reports reclassified Marines with chilling clarity. Marines will not retreat. Marines will counterattack, even when it is tactically suicidal. Marine morale does not degrade with casualties. Marine units do not lose effectiveness until entirely destroyed. In other words, the Americans had created a warrior caste. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence had undergone a complete psychological inversion. What had once been dismissed as American softness was now being recorded as something dangerously close to fanaticism. Officers who had fought in China and Manchuria, under the belief that the Imperial Japanese Army represented the pinnacle of warrior discipline, now struggled to explain why Marines behaved with a level of resolve that defied every cultural stereotype. Captain Yoshio Kobayashi, who survived Guadalcanal before dying on Bougainville, wrote a desperate analysis comparing Marine infantry to American Army infantry. His report noted that soldiers of the U.S. Army fought competently, adhered to doctrine, and responded predictably to casualties and tactical setbacks. But when he turned his attention to the Marines, his words took a darker tone. Marines fight as if casualties do not matter. They advance when any logical commander would halt. Their losses seem to fuel them instead of slow them. This is unprecedented in modern war. Japanese planners also underestimated the speed at which Marines operated. The Japanese garrison on Peleliu learned this the hard way. Lieutenant Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had carefully prepared his defenses, expecting Americans to pause after landing, as most armies naturally did to regroup. But the Marines didn't pause. In a single day, they seized half the airfield under blistering heat and murderous fire. Nakagawa watched his carefully planned defense unravel in mere hours, and in his diary he recorded the conclusion that Japanese soldiers across the Pacific would eventually reach: the Marines do not behave rationally. They attack until they achieve their objective, no matter the cost. This blunt realization forced Japanese commanders to reevaluate their entire strategic approach. They were facing an enemy willing to accept catastrophic casualties, backed by a nation capable of replacing every loss faster than Japan could bury its dead. A scene from Bougainville showed this imbalance clearly. Sergeant Kenji Matsumoto had been ordered to hold a fortified hilltop with interlocking bunkers and heavy machine guns sweeping the approach. Japanese doctrine dictated an extended artillery barrage before any assault. After all, no commander would willingly send men across open ground into 3 entrenched firing lines. But that's exactly what the Marines did. A Marine lieutenant studied the battlefield for mere seconds before ordering his platoon forward. The first volleys of Japanese fire cut men down instantly, but the remainder continued advancing, bounding forward, destroying one bunker at a time in explosions of grenades and rifle fire. When the battle ended, a third of the Marine platoon was dead or wounded, but the hill was taken. The entire action took 4 minutes. To Japanese witnesses, the attack seemed suicidal. To Marine commanders, it was simply the cost of seizing a necessary position. Matsumoto later wrote, "The Marines treated casualties like a currency. They spent them freely to buy victory, and they always had more to spend." This cold arithmetic horrified Japanese officers. They were prepared to give their lives for the emperor, but they did not expect the Americans, portrayed as pleasure-loving, undisciplined Westerners, to display the same willingness to die, and to combine that willingness with devastating firepower. Marine attacks were not reckless. They were calculated, supported by an industrial machine Japan could not comprehend. Even a small marine assault was a coordinated symphony of rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery, naval gunfire, and air support. To Japanese defenders, it looked like chaos. But it was the opposite. Every move was synced across ranks and units, something Japanese forces struggled to match. Second Lieutenant Toshio Yamamoto, captured on Saipan, described his shock during a nighttime observation. 3 days after the landings, we expected to find exhausted men, hungry, low on ammunition, and shaken. This is what our forces would have been under such conditions. Instead, we saw Marines eating hot meals. We saw trucks delivering ammunition under heavy fire. We saw medical tents packed with supplies. They fought the most intense battle of the war while living better than Japanese troops in peacetime. This was the true face of the enemy, relentless, well-supplied, and unbreakable. Japan's defenders had been trained to believe that sacrifice and spiritual purity would triumph over wealth and machinery. But they discovered that American machinery did not replace spirit. It amplified it. Every Marine had food, water, ammunition, medical support, and reliable rifles. Every Japanese soldier had less of all three, and sometimes none. And yet, despite overwhelming American firepower, the defining terror of fighting Marines was psychological. Japanese soldiers realized that no amount of bloodshed could slow the American advance. Every casualty they inflicted, and they inflicted thousands, was immediately replaced. Japanese casualties were permanent. American casualties were temporary. That unbalanced equation repeated itself island after island. On Peleliu, for instance, the 1st Marine Division suffered such immense losses that it had to be withdrawn. For most armies, this would mark a temporary collapse, a force broken by attrition. But in weeks, the Marine Division was back to full strength and returned to combat. Japan had no equivalent system. A battalion that lost half its men was finished. A Marine battalion that lost half its men was back on the line in days with replacements who fought just as fiercely. By late 1944, Japanese High Command confronted a grim truth. Marines could not be stopped. They could only be delayed. Intelligence memos that fell into American hands showed a deepening despair. Do not expect to hold any position indefinitely. Do not expect the Marines to retreat. Do not believe that inflicting mass casualties will degrade their will. Their replacements will arrive faster than ammunition can be resupplied. In short, Japan admitted the war in the Pacific was mathematically unwinnable. And yet the fighting continued, grinding forward with increasing brutality as the Marines prepared to invade their most fortified target yet, a volcanic island whose defenders had already accepted they would die in place. Iwo Jima. The island where all of these lessons, all of these fears, and all of these brutal realities would converge in a single, catastrophic explosion of violence. By the time the Marines approached Iwo Jima in early 1945, Japanese commanders no longer fooled themselves with fantasies of victory. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu had forced a brutal education upon them. They had watched the same pattern unfold every time. The Marines landed under monstrous fire, suffered shocking casualties, and yet pushed inland with a forward momentum that felt less like tactics and more like inevitability. General Tadamichi Suribachi, the man chosen to prepare Iwo Jima's defenses, studied these battles with a cold, analytical mind. Unlike many of his peers, he understood that the Imperial Japanese Army's traditional doctrines, banzai attacks, mass nighttime charges, heroic last stands, were useless against the enemy now approaching his island. He knew he was up against a military machine unlike anything Japan had ever faced. So he crafted a strategy built not on hope, but on arithmetic. Suribachi knew that he could not stop the Marines. He could not defeat the Marines. He could not even slow the Marines for long. His mission, as he wrote to Tokyo, was purely mathematical, to kill as many Marines as possible before his garrison was inevitably annihilated. Iwo Jima was never meant to be held. It was meant to bleed the enemy. He built 11 miles of tunnels, interlinking more than 1,500 fortified positions. Every bunker was shielded by multiple layers of concrete and volcanic rock. Every field of fire was planned months in advance. Every cave was angled to create overlapping kill zones. He banned banzai charges entirely, Wasting men in suicidal runs would accomplish nothing. Instead, he ordered his forces to stay underground until Marines were so close that retreat would be impossible. When the American fleet opened fire on February 19th, the island hardly trembled. The bombardment that was supposed to obliterate the defenses barely scratched them. Suribachi had designed a buried fortress, not a surface defense. He knew exactly what would happen next, and he was right. At 8:59 a.m., the first wave of Marines hit the black volcanic sand. They stepped into a nightmare they could barely comprehend. The moment their boots sank into the loose terrain, Japanese artillery observers on Mount Suribachi began transmitting coordinates with machine-like precision. The slaughter began instantly. But then something occurred that stunned every Japanese defender watching. The Marines kept coming. They used the bodies of the dead as cover. They crawled forward through smoke, fire, and sand that swallowed their legs to the shin. They dragged wounded men by their belts and rifles. They shielded each other from machine gun bursts. And they advanced, always forward, never back. Suribachi's artillery pounded the beaches so relentlessly that even the Japanese were horrified by the devastation. And yet the Marines, in wave after wave, kept landing. Entire units were shredded on the beach. Others reached the protective dunes only to be cut down by perfectly calibrated mortar fire. But by the end of the day, the Marines had created a foothold. Shallow, bloody, fragile, but real. Suribachi had expected them to stall. They didn't. They pushed straight into the maze of tunnels and interconnected bunkers. Every captured position revealed two more waiting behind it. The fighting devolved into close-quarters darkness where flamethrowers ruled and grenades never stopped exploding. In bunker after bunker, Japanese defenders saw Marines do things that made no sense in Japanese doctrine. A flamethrower operator would fall to machine gun fire, and instantly another Marine would grab the tank and continue the attack. If that man died, another would take his place. If he died too, demolition teams crawled forward under fire with explosives in their teeth, detonating charges at point-blank range. One Japanese private, whose diary was found after the battle, described watching a Marine flamethrower team assault a position. The first man was shot. The second man took his weapon and burned half the chamber before he fell. A third Marine dragged himself forward with wounds that should have killed him. He kept firing until the fuel tank was empty. Then he used grenades. How do we defeat men who refuse to die? This was the question echoing across every cave on Iwo Jima. The Marines moved with a discipline that stunned Japanese commanders. When a bunker held up the advance, NCOs, not officers, adjusted tactics immediately. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't fall back. They improvised under fire with terrifying speed. Corporal Hideo Takahashi, who survived 3 campaigns before Okinawa, described this adaptability in a post-war interview. They fought like predators, silent, coordinated, aware of every movement. And, when one was killed, another took his exact place without hesitation. It was like fighting a single creature with many bodies. Japanese soldiers were prepared to die, but they were not prepared for an enemy willing to match their willingness to die while also bringing tanks, artillery, naval gunfire, dive bombers, and flamethrowers into every engagement. On Iwo Jima, Suribachi watched his perfect defensive plan begin to unravel, not because it was flawed, but because the Marines were willing to endure casualties that should have broken any sane fighting force. In his final message to Tokyo, smuggled out on March 21st, he wrote, "The Marines are the most formidable soldiers I have ever encountered. Their discipline, their firepower, and their refusal to break make them a force that cannot be defeated. We can only delay them, we cannot stop them. They will take this island because they do not accept any result other than victory." By then, his garrison had been reduced to a fraction of its strength. The tunnels that once held thousands now held corpses, smoke, and blood. But the Marines kept advancing, always advancing, until the last defended position fell under a storm of grenades, demolitions, tanks, and flamethrowers. The island was a graveyard of courage on both sides. But only one side had the industrial power, medical care, and replacements to keep fighting on dozens of other islands. By the time Iwo Jima fell, Japanese commanders across the Pacific understood the truth. Fighting the Marines was not a battle, it was an appointment with death. Japan could never match the Marines. Japan could never stop the Marines. Japan could only delay the Marines, for a price paid entirely in blood. As the Marines pushed deeper across Iwo Jima's volcanic ridges, the scale of their resolve, and the scale of Japan's miscalculation, became undeniable. Every defensive line that Suribachi had crafted with mathematical precision was eventually breached. Every strong point meant to hold for days collapsed within hours. Every fallback position, every cave system, every fortified bunker was fought over with a savagery neither side had truly anticipated. But here was the difference. Japanese defenders died where they stood. Marines died, were replaced, and returned to the line in numbers Japan could not fathom. This reality haunted Japanese intelligence officers long before the battle ended. They had studied American operations on Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, and Leyte. They had watched the Marines take shocking casualties and return to full combat strength weeks later. They had watched entire Marine regiments be rebuilt overnight with new replacements who fought like men who had already endured years of battle. These observations shattered a fundamental assumption at the heart of Japanese strategy. Spirit alone could not defeat an enemy who possessed equal spirit and overwhelming material superiority. On Saipan, a captured Japanese officer wrote a bewildered report after witnessing a Marine battalion absorbed nearly 50% casualties in a single night attack, only to resume offensive operations at dawn with the same violence and organization as before. He wrote, "If the same losses were inflicted upon one of our battalions, it would cease to exist. But Marines continue as if death itself is irrelevant." This was the hidden engine behind the Marine Corps' battlefield dominance. It was not only courage. It was a fusion of training, cultural identity, leadership structure, and industrial backing. Marine culture itself was unlike anything the Japanese had encountered. Captured documents from Saipan, translated by intelligence officers, included the interrogation of a Marine private who explained the transformation every recruit endured. Boot camp begins by destroying the civilian. You are told every day that you are not a Marine, that you will never earn that title. The instructors push until something inside you breaks, and then you are rebuilt. The second half of training is where you are told that you are part of a family that goes back to 1775, that every Marine who ever lived earned that name through suffering, that you carry them with you and you can't dishonor them. You fight because of that. You don't quit because you're not allowed to quit. You belong to something larger than yourself. Japanese officers who read this report underlined a single sentence. They are taught that surrender is worse than death. This shocked them. That was supposed to be Japan's cultural advantage. Instead, they found an American force whose mentality mirrored Bushido, but whose weapons, supplies, and logistics exceeded anything the Japanese warrior code could compensate for. The psychological shock of fighting such an enemy was profound. Japanese soldiers had been told Americans feared close combat. But on islands across the Pacific, they discovered the opposite. During the massive Banzai attack on Saipan, 3,000 Japanese soldiers charged into Marine lines expecting them to crumble in terror. Instead, Marines fought back with bayonets, pistols, rifles, trench knives, and even bare hands. Machine gunners fired point blank, artillery units rotated their guns to zero elevation, and medics dropped tourniquets to grab rifles. When dawn came, nearly the entire Japanese force lay dead. The Marines suffered casualties, but they had not broken. They had stood, bled, killed, and still held the line. A surviving Japanese private who was pulled unconscious from the field later said, "We expected fear. We found steel." Marine adaptability was another shock Japan could not cope with. The Imperial Japanese Army required strict adherence to hierarchy. Orders flowed downward. Initiative flowed nowhere. Marines did the opposite. Sergeants made battlefield decisions normally reserved for Japanese captains. Corporals coordinated fire and maneuver tactics that in Japan's doctrine would require a full officer's authority. This decentralization made them terrifying opponents. When a bunker halted the advance, Marines didn't wait for orders. They shifted angles, flanked, used smoke, called in tanks, or crawled forward with satchel charges. Japanese defenders often had only seconds between identifying a problem and being overrun by a sudden shift in enemy tactics. Lieutenant Shigeru Fukuda, before his death on Guadalcanal, wrote, "By the time our commander understands the situation, the Marines have already changed it. This speed of adaptation, combined with overwhelming fire support, made Japanese positions effectively temporary. Even the most resilient fortifications could only delay the inevitable." But no weapon terrified Japanese defenders more than the flamethrower. Flamethrowers collapsed the entire concept of honorable death. Burning caves filled with smoke, screams, and unimaginable heat broke the morale of even the most fanatically indoctrinated soldiers. Japanese troops who believed they were ready to die discovered that fire triggered a primal terror that erased ideology. A corporal captured on Okinawa with severe burns said, "We were ready to die, but not like that. No one is ready for fire." And the Marines used the weapon with unflinching precision, clearing caves, bunkers, and tunnel networks that had been considered suicide-proof. By 1944 and 1945, Japanese forces across the Pacific were distributing intelligence reports that sounded less like military documents and more like warnings carved by men facing extinction. One such report captured on Tinian listed 5 undeniable truths about Marine forces. Marines are physically stronger due to superior nutrition. Marines receive better weapons and unlimited ammunition. Marine marksmanship is unmatched by Japanese infantry. Marines possess overwhelming artillery, air, and naval support. Marines do not surrender. They fight until dead or victorious. The report concluded with a stark statement: positions will fall. Expect annihilation. This was not propaganda. It was resignation. By the time the Marines reached Okinawa, Japanese command already knew their last lines of defense were doomed. Iwo Jima had proven what every battle since 1942 had been teaching: courage without resources meets courage with resources, and courage with resources wins every time. But the Japanese defenders still fought. They had been conditioned to die, and the Marines, driven by their own brutal doctrine, met them with equal ferocity. Okinawa would be the bloodiest lesson of all. When the smoke finally settled over Iwo Jima and the last bunker fell silent, Japanese high command faced an irrevocable truth. They had not been fighting ordinary infantry. They had been fighting a force bred for relentless forward motion, men whose bodies could be broken but whose advance could not. What happened on Iwo Jima was not a fluke. It was the inevitable outcome of facing an enemy who combines spiritual endurance with industrial might. The same pattern emerged again during the final catastrophic campaign of the Pacific War, Okinawa. Here, on the doorstep of Japan's home islands, the Marines encountered the largest, most desperate defensive force Japan had assembled throughout the war. Over 100,000 Japanese troops, entrenched in limestone ridges, caves, and tunnels, waited for the Americans with instructions nearly identical to Suribachi's: "You cannot win. You can only kill as many Americans as possible before you die." And yet, once again, the outcome was the same. The Marines advanced through deadly machine gun crossfires, kamikaze air attacks, mud-filled ravines, and razor-backed ridges. They fought through terrain that turned every hill into a slaughterhouse. They buried entire companies in mud, endured rain that turned foxholes into wells, and navigated lines so dense with mines that engineers sometimes cleared ground with bayonets. They took Shuri Castle under a storm of fire. They fought night attacks that tore through their lines. They engaged in hand-to-hand battles in positions so tight that men described fighting inches away from enemies they could barely see. But they did not break. Japanese survivors of Okinawa, interviewed years after the war, recalled the same horror echoed from Guadalcanal to Saipan to Iwo Jima. They fought as if death was irrelevant. They fought as if pain meant nothing. They fought until their last man could no longer lift his weapon. One Japanese officer, who lived long enough to see Okinawa's surrender, admitted, "We were told Americans loved comfort. We were told Americans feared death. But the Marines showed us Americans who loved victory more than comfort and who feared disgrace more than death." This shattered the most fundamental propaganda the Japanese soldier had been taught. The Marines were not decadent Westerners. They were warriors in the truest sense. warriors who fought with the same willingness to die as Japanese soldiers, but backed by tanks, naval guns, aircraft, flamethrowers, corpsmen, and endless supply lines. They fought with the same ferocity as samurai, but with an industrial nation behind them. They matched Japan's legendary spirit, but enhanced it with firepower Japan could never match. The results were devastatingly predictable. Every island Japan defended became a tomb. Every banzai charge became a massacre. Every fortified cave became a furnace. Every ridge became a graveyard. Japanese leadership finally understood a truth that had been present since Guadalcanal. They were fighting a modern army with feudal doctrine. By mid-1945, captured Japanese officers gave testimony that broke from decades of indoctrination. They admitted that fighting Marines was unlike fighting any other force. One officer stated, "Their strength was not their weapons, their strength was their unity. When one fell, another replaced him instantly. When a leader died, another stepped forward without hesitation. Their courage was matched only by their resources. Marines returned the respect, even if it came wrapped in bitterness." They knew the Japanese soldier fought with astonishing bravery. They understood that their enemy had been asked to do the impossible. They saw firsthand the difference between indoctrination and capability, between courage and preparedness, between willingness to die and the means to fight effectively. After the war, Allied interrogators collected thousands of Japanese diaries. Nearly all of them shared a consistent theme about the Marines. We were told Americans were weak. We discovered that the Marines were the strongest warriors we had ever faced. This respect, earned in fire, blood, and suffering, cut both ways. Marines who returned home knew that their hardest battles had been against defenders who fought to the last man. But even as they honored Japanese courage, they never forgot the overwhelming truth that shaped every battle. Japan's soldiers fought with courage alone. Marines fought with courage, backed by a nation's entire industrial, medical, and logistical power. It was not courage that won the war. It was courage plus capability. And no Japanese soldier understood this more clearly than General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, author of the Iwo Jima defense, who left behind one final message before the island slipped away into American control. In his last known transmission, he wrote, "The Marines have every advantage: firepower, intelligence, leadership, and unbreakable will. Japan cannot conquer such an enemy. They will take this island and they will take the next. They will come to our homeland. We cannot stop them." He was right. The Marines were coming. But Japan surrendered before that invasion could begin, not because its spirit failed, but because its spirit met a force that combined everything Japan valued with everything Japan lacked. In the end, every Japanese soldier who fought the Marines learned a final bitter lesson. Spirit alone is not enough. Courage alone is not enough. Determination alone is not enough. When matched against an enemy who possesses all three, and who also has air supremacy, naval supremacy, mechanized logistics, and overwhelming firepower, the outcome becomes inevitable. Japan's soldiers discovered that inevitability island by island, bunker by bunker, ridge by ridge. The diaries of dying men found in caves and tunnels all echoed the same realization: we fought with all the courage we had. But the Marines fought with courage and everything else. And that, more than anything, is why Japanese soldiers feared the Marines above all others. It wasn't strength alone. It wasn't bravery alone. It wasn't ruthlessness alone. It was the totality of force, the perfect storm of discipline, culture, firepower, training, adaptability, and relentless will. The Marines did not fight to survive. They fought to win. They fought until no enemy remained. They fought with a clarity of purpose that made resistance hopeless. That is why every island fell. That is why every defensive plan collapsed. That is why the Pacific War ended the way it did. The Japanese soldier said it best: they were what we claimed to be. We were what we claimed they were. And that truth, written in diaries soaked with blood and sand, is the ultimate testament to why the Marines were feared, respected, and ultimately unstoppable across the Pacific.